what does it look like on your end? Because it doesn't show up that it says something upcoming, but it's. I think we are live now. I think there is a live stream that says upcoming, so it could be that we are actually live. What does it say on you? Yeah, we are live. We should be live now.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It worked in the end. We had some, like I said, some technical issues today. So I'm so sorry about the delay for this monthly live stream. And I should probably introduce my guest now, which is we are joined this month by Thomas W. Smith, who has been with us last time when we discussed the First Crusade in and his book Rewriting the First Crusade, which is about the letters written during the First Crusade. Now, I'm going to share that we are live on social media before we get any just in, and while we are waiting for the just to come in, if there will be any just at all. And I should also add that we are live now, but you should also be available to watch this after we have ended the live stream. So if you missed the live, don't worry, we will do this. We try to do monthly live streams on the podcast on YouTube. And sorry for the weak quality today, because we had to use different, and the web camera wouldn't work for some reason on this on this screen. But yeah, we should be live.
We are live.
We are, yeah. So there you go. I've changed it for the better, and yeah, we should start to talk about the Crusades today. And while I shared that we are live on social media, finally at last, why don't you tell us about what the Crusade, how you ended up studying the Crusade, and what was it about this Crusade that fascinated you? Where did this where did this fascination come from?
Yeah, so I was just sharing that we are live now. This is good.
Yeah.
Thanks for getting it going. You put a lot of hard work into that. So.
You've been very patient, so thank you for that.
Oh, no worries. I know what these things are like as a teacher. Technical difficulties are the bane of my life. No. How did I get? I love
especially that for someone who are technological incapable. So yeah.
No, I'm impressed, man. You got this going. You did a great job. So all power to you. Crusade history. Yeah, I got really into it when I was a teenager. So when I was younger, I was really into medieval knights and castles and Lego knights and things like that. And when I was a teenager, there were a few things that happened. There was this inflection point, I think, when I was about 16 or 17, probably. I was in the lower sixth form, I think, at school. And what happened is Kingdom of Heaven came out in the cinemas, which was epic. And also Tom Asbridge's book, The First Crusade, A New History, came out. And he wrote an article in BBC History magazine. And I read those. And it just all came together at this time, and it really gave me a focus for my interest, and I just became really fascinated by it. I think it's such an interesting phenomenon which seems very alien to us today, to think about why people would get involved in a holy war anyway, but why would they leave their homes and their families and think about it as a form of pilgrimage, as religious devotion, and actually they see this as they're doing something divine by going on crusade. It seems so alien, such a strange concept. I think a really interesting one, and there are so many different facets to it to explore, and the lasting cultural legacy of the Crusades. I think all these things just came together to make it, this point that I really wanted to work on. And I studied it at university. I did a PhD about Crusades history, and then I've written some books and articles about it, and it's really just sustained my interest. And I just think it's a fascinating topic, really.
Now, we're going to talk about the general Crusade history today, and not just the First Crusade as we did in the First Crusade episode. But let's begin at the First Crusade, because that's where it obviously all started. But as we discussed in our episode, and I would highly recommend checking it out, we just talked about how Jerusalem were, actually taken 90 years before. Actually, I want to go way before this, because Jerusalem has been taken even way before this. I believe in the Great war against Persia as well. So why was there no Crusader movement then? I believe they did try attempt. I think it was under the Great War of Persia that Jerusalem was taken. So
Mm.
why was there no attempt for Crusader holy war then, and why first in the 10th century was there 90 years after Jerusalem was taken? Why first then did they start to have a call for crusade?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Jerusalem's been a flashpoint for conflict for hundreds and thousands of years, really. And why does the First Crusade happen when it does? It's a really interesting question. There's actually an attempt to get a crusade off the ground by a predecessor of Pope Urban II called Gregory VII. So in the 1070s, he basically tries to get a project off the ground, which looks very much like the First Crusade or some sort of proto-crusade. So he's promoting this idea of pilgrimage, of holy war, going to Jerusalem to recover Jerusalem, and actually this just doesn't take off. So it's quite interesting. He's pitching pretty much the same idea, more or less, as what Urban II does in 1095, but 20 years beforehand, it doesn't get the traction. And I think what's interesting about the First Crusade is it's a complete phenomenon, and it's quite a unique one in the sense that I think for Urban II, I think he has this Goldilocks moment where the conditions are just right to launch this thing. It's an incredible achievement to get people to leave their homes and probably go and die on crusade and march across the face of the world. And I think what happens really is you get this sort of intersection of a number of different things. You've got the papal reform movement, where the papacy is trying to expand its authority. You've got growing lay involvement in defending churches and sort of holy sanctioning of warfare through the peace of God and truce of gods, and the church trying to control how warfare happens. And you've got the growth of mass pilgrimage to places like Jerusalem, which is really building up over the course of the 11th century. And then you've got this electrifying speech that Urban II delivers at the Council of Clermont, and this offer of the indulgence of remission of sins. So people who go on the crusade will get all of their sins wiped clean. You've also got these, so those are the kind of pull factors. This, why would people want to go to Jerusalem? We've also got push factors as well. We're looking at the climatic conditions in Western Europe at this time. Actually, there's been some famines and poor harvests, and some people want to go because actually they want to seek a better life in the East. So it's quite an incredible thing that he gets it off the ground. And I think that it wouldn't have perhaps happened in earlier periods because you don't have that intersection of those different factors coming together at just the right time in this kind of Goldilocks moment for Urban II, when the conditions are just right to launch this crusade, and it happens. It's quite an incredible thing, and I think it's kind of a one-off. It's a bit of a freak kind of accident, really, that it actually happens and actually works.
So did he actually, did Pope Urban actually have any faith that this would take off the way it did, or was he just hoping for a few thousand troops, perhaps, to come to his aid? That some money, some money from some kings, and say just help. I don't think you did. Do you think you did expect it to take off the way that it did?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably no, he doesn't expect it to take off in the way that it does. I think, as you say, what he's expecting is probably to recruit, we're talking hundreds here, of knights, essentially mercenaries who are going to go over to the east to fight on behalf of the Byzantine Empire to defend it from the Seljuk Turks. That's what the Emperor of Byzantium had requested. So he had sent requests to the Pope a couple of times asking for knights to go out and fight for him. And this was actually something which had been going on for quite a long time. So you've got the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, which is very famous. And we think that some of the Anglo-Saxon warriors from the Battle of Hastings, some of the defeated ones, go over and fight in Byzantium. So there's a kind of tradition of these Western knights in kind of fairly small numbers going over to fight in Byzantium. And I think that's what Alexios, the Emperor of Byzantium, is expecting, and that's what Urban II is expecting. And I think he doesn't quite expect what's going to happen in terms of how the idea runs away with itself. This offer he's making really sets a fire under the religious enthusiasm of the people of the West, which I don't think he's expecting to the extent that it does. And there's this it's called like a great rumor that spreads, and it goes out of control of the papacy, I think, actually. And the reason why it's so successful is partially because, of course, the papacy does a great job of promoting it, but also because it taps into these undercurrents of popular devotion, and people really want to they find this very appealing and very attractive and want to go on it. And Urban II lights that fuse at Claremont, but actually the reason why it's so successful it's not just to do with him, basically.
Now, here's another thing I want to point out as well, because it's not too long before there's the great schism of Rome and Eastern Roman Empire, where they go their separate ways, so to speak. So, was there hope as well, both on Urban and Alexius' side, that this could perhaps help heal the wound from the Great Schism, and that this could perhaps bring both churches from the Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholic Church together again? Was there hope in this as well? Because as you know, they had quite a rocky relationship after the Great Schism, and it would of course never heal. But was there hope with this as well?
Yeah, so when the two churches kind of lose contact with each other and they're doing their own thing, the Eastern and the Western churches, I think this does play a role in this as well. I think obviously the unity of those churches is a good thing at a time when the papacy is promoting this idea of itself as the leader of the universal church. So the papacy wants to establish itself as the leader of the worldwide Christian church, and at the time it's obviously only the leader of the Western church, because there have been these original patriarchates, and Rome was one of them, but it had been on the same level as some of these other ones in the Eastern church. And so I think this is an opportunity for the papacy to try and solidify its position. But I think on the other hand, we've got to be careful about this idea. One of the things I've tried to nuance is this idea that the papacy has this kind of grand strategic plan that it's trying to kind of take over the world, basically, to put it in its basic terms, and that this is an attempt to expand its influence entirely. I think it's in a more subtle way, but definitely I think that would have been an advantage to the papacy to increase and repair relations.
Now, I actually want to go a little bit on the other side of the crusade, and there is a book about this. It's all right, but it's called the Crusades from the Muslims' perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the reaction from the Muslim world and how quickly does news travel. I mean, obviously, when the Crusaders come, they kind of realize that something up, but how quickly does the Muslim world take a grip of this, that there is a crusade or holy war again, or jihad, if you want to use that language, against them, and that they want to take back Jerusalem? So what was the reaction from that side when this first is being launched, and how quickly do they become aware that there is such a thing going on?
I think this is one of the key areas of popular understanding of the First Crusade. We can bring some ones here. I think that the monolithic explanation is that there's a clash of civilization between Christianity and Islam, but actually a lot of scholarship has shown that's not the case. I think that's probably one of the ideas that people have made when they the Crusades. Actually, it's much more complex than that, and it's not a clash of civilizations, and it's not just Christians versus Muslims. I think actually what's really interesting is the First Crusade, actually they make lots of alliances with Muslim powers, and they fight together basically against other Muslim powers in the region. So it's much more messy and much more complex and much more interesting. And I think what's going on really is that when the Crusaders enter the Near East, they're just a group of other foreigners who are fighting in the region. There's tons of foreign groups of soldiers, of mercenaries, armies who are fighting there, contesting over this land. And the crusade doesn't seem to stand out as particularly different from other ones. It's just another foreign fighter operating in this theatre. And it's only later, I think, that it becomes clear to the Muslim powers of the Near East that crusaders are actually bent on kind of colonialism, setting up these states, and that they've settle and colonize the Holy Land and to stay there, they think permanently. And I think that idea is slower to spread, because actually, when you look at the geopolitical situation, it's not this kind of monolith of Islamic power. Actually, you've got lots of these different smaller Muslim lords who are fighting for control, basically. And so it's often in their interest to ally with the Crusaders, and the Crusaders often ally with them as well to achieve their interest. It's only the idea of jihad as a sort of counter crusade does exist at the time of the First Crusade. From the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, you get jihad poetry that is coming out very soon afterwards, which is lamenting the loss of Jerusalem and what the Franks, the Crusaders, have done. But this idea, it only really starts to come together from the middle of the 12th century with leaders like Zengi, Nur-ad-Din, Saladin, who start to really shape this counter-crusade jihad idea and really unify the Muslims against the Crusaders and try and push them out. But they do that through force, really. So people like Saladin actually spends most of his career fighting other Muslims rather than Crusaders, but he needs to do that first to unite his kind of domain, basically, before his dominion, before he can then start to try and push the Crusaders out.
Now, we have to take, like you said, the geopolitical structure as well, because we have three main empires in this. And the main empire that the Crusaders goes after is, of course, the Seljuk Turks after the Battle of Manzikert, which happened a few years earlier. But as well, we have those are the main enemies in the First Crusade. But we also have the Fatimid Caliphates and the failing Abbasid Caliphate, which is kind of irrelevant at this point in history. But was there? Were they aware that the other caliphates, were they aware that the Seljuks were the main enemy, and did they want to kind of benefit from this crusade, that they could perhaps be some easy territory grabs here and there that could advance to, say, the Fatimids or the caliphates, or did they try to help the Seljuks in the fight against the infidel, for the lack of better words?
Yes, I mean, I think this kind of swirling geopolitical situation with these different powers all facing off against each other and fighting each other is the main reason why the First Crusade succeeds. I think it would have been very difficult for the First Crusaders to have achieved what they did if they weren't entering a war zone, basically, which they could exploit to their own ends. So I think in terms of what's really interesting is how much do the Crusaders know about the sort of complexities of this geopolitical situation. Now, I think based on the source material that we've got that the Crusaders leave us, there is evidence that they have some understanding of this complexity. But equally, a lot of the sources that are written in the West just after the First Crusade, which is the vast majority of sources we have about the First Crusade, actually it's kind of airbrushed, and this a lot of this complexity is lost, and the enemy is of the Crusaders is portrayed as sort of two-dimensional enemy, and you don't get that complexity that you're talking about. But I think very much so they appreciate it on the ground, probably, because actually they're clearly making these alliances with Muslim powers and fighting other ones. I think it would be inconceivable that they don't appreciate some of these complexities. And we do see in some of the eyewitness sources them trying to reflect the different groups that they're encountering. And so you can see that the kind of range of the names of Muslim leaders, they're very careful to give very long lists of names of the emirs that they're fighting. And so they do understand it, but I think it's filtered through the sources and garbled as we have it. So I think they probably have a more complex understanding than the primary sources suggest. But I think people in the West who are reading, listening to these kind of sources that are written after the First Crusade, they probably have a more basic understanding, I think, of what actually is going on in the Near East at this time.
So you mentioned earlier that a lot of people actually went and tried to get a better life, and as we talked about in the First Crusade episode as well, there were quite a few that converted to Islam as well when they came. And you have, I don't remember his name, Adelbert, I think, actually came to learn. I don't remember if it is Adelbert. There was a English Anglo-Saxon scientist that came. And do forgive me, I think it's Adelbert, but perhaps someone in the chat know this. But if you do, please leave a comment if you know who I'm talking about. But there were some people who came actually to learn from Muslims as well, and bring back scientific research that would later inspire scientists such as Frederick Bacon or the Bacon brothers, the Bacons, as for example. No relation to Kevin Bacon, I'm sure, but they. It wasn't only, like you said, it was not just for fighting in the Crusade, but it was also for scientific research, and some people, like you said, some people converted as well.
Yeah, I think definitely this is the key point here is that actually the relations between the Christians and Muslims in the region are not just defined by conflict, and that actually, as you say, it's a more nuanced picture where there's interaction and connection and exchange, cultural and intellectual exchange as well going on, and so it's a really complex picture. And I think that's one of the key things that I think a lot of research is trying to push, that actually, this outdated idea that's this clash of civilizations, these monoliths fighting each other, is really unsustainable now, and especially when you put those types of thing into the picture that you're mentioning there.
So let's talk about some of the epic wars that took place, and let's talk a little bit about, for example, say begin with the siege of Antioch, for example. I think let's talk about a little bit the siege. We have the Groen as well. We have other Crusades to talk about, but let's talk about some of the sieges and wars that took place in the First Crusade.
So there's basically, when they reach the Holy Land, a number of key battles and sieges that define really the course of the First Crusade. There's major sieges that we're thinking about. First is of Nicaea, which is Asia Minor, and to the city that belongs to Byzantines. And the Crusaders are actually working really well in collaboration with the Greeks on the Crusade up to this point. They actually have a really good working relationship. And again, we're thinking about those sources that are produced later which want to sully this relationship, but actually up to this point they're actually working really well together. They managed to capture Nicaea by besieging the city, but actually this ingenious move that Alexios, the Byzantine emperor, does, which wins the city for the Crusade, is that he sends, basically it's the city that backs onto a huge lake, and the Crusaders encircle it from the land, but what they can't do is obviously stop their enemy bringing provisions and reinforcements in across the lake. And so the Greek emperor has these ships brought to the lake, and then he sails them on the lake basically, and then they enforce the blockade, and he takes the terms of surrender from the Turks, and they capture the city. So that's the first big siege. You've got some other big battles as well, like Dorylaeum is a big Crusader battle from the first day, which is really important. And then really I guess the two key other sieges are Antioch and then Jerusalem. So Antioch is a massively grueling siege, incredibly difficult conditions. Antioch is a really big city. It's got this huge ring of really massive walls around it and towers, and it's built on these kind of craggy outcrops. It's in really difficult terrain. A lot of it's in this kind of, it's got big ravines around it. It's very difficult to besiege this city because it's just so vast, and it's really very, very difficult. And the Crusaders basically hammer away at this city for about 9 months trying to break into Antioch, and they can't do it. And infamously, one of the leaders, Bohemond, who is a very wily commander, he manages to strike up a deal with a turncoat commander of one of the towers, basically, who's probably annoyed because that his boss had an affair with his wife, and so that's probably possibly allegedly one of the reasons why he betrays the city. But he strikes a deal with Bohemond to betray the city to the Crusaders. Bohemond goes back to the other Crusade leaders and says, look, can we all agree that whoever manages to come up with a solution for taking the city will take control of it, will own the city? And everyone agrees. And then he reveals his hand and he says, I've got this understanding with the tower commander. And so soon afterwards, the tower commander at a specified time drops a ladder or a rope down the tower that he commands. The Crusaders go in, they slaughter the defenders on the walls, they open one of the gates, the Crusaders pour in, and they massacre the population. So that's one of the huge kind of engagements of the Crusade. And then what happens is actually the Crusaders then become themselves besieged within the city. Ironically, they manage to take control of the city, and they do it just in time because a Muslim relief army under Kilij Arslan is arriving, and
Is
he
this
starts
really
to besiege.
Arslan the second, or is this still the first from the massacre?
Um, yeah, this is you'll test my memory here. I think it's
Mhm.
the I think it's the I think it's the first. I think. Is there a Roman numeral
Mhm.
in there?
Because
I think
there's
it's the
two,
first.
from what I remember. There is two, but
Yeah.
I don't remember when the second one is
No,
named. So,
this might be the second one. It might. I may. We'll have to look this up after. If
mhm,
anyone wants to comment in the thing.
mhm.
But Kilij Arslan basically then besieges the Crusaders, so they're stuck. They haven't actually taken the citadel of Antioch. So there, some of the Muslim defenders are inside the citadel. The Crusaders are in the city walls, and then Kilij Arslan is outside and starts basically become besieged. And they decide finally to go out in sort of in glory, sort of basically, and decide like we're gonna die, we're gonna go out and give it a go. And miraculously, seemingly to the Crusaders, they managed to rout Kilij Arslan's force, and there's I think just their sheer desperation probably does it for them, and their religious devotion as well, and they managed to see off Kilij Arslan. Then they marched down the coast near the coast to Jerusalem, and they reached in July 1095 after a short siege in July. They managed to capture the city on the 15th of July 1099, and they used siege towers, and they managed to storm the city through conventional means this time. And then when they break into the city, they begin another horrific massacre, and the sources record that they're wading up to their ankles or in knees in blood, and it's drawing on biblical references. And some of the more recent scholarship has tempered this idea that they massacre absolutely everybody within the city, but what's certain is that there is a really terrible massacre of the people in the city, and then they take control of it, and that's the end of the First Crusade. Pretty much there was a battle at Ascalon afterwards, where again miraculously they managed to see off an Egyptian force that's come to relieve Jerusalem, and then they set up these Crusades.
Another thing that is kind of significant with the siege of Antioch, I think it's just at the siege of Antioch, is that they find, of course, it's not we know that it's not, but they also find these so-called holy lands to boost morale against the troops that will be very important throughout the crusade with Saladin and, of course, later Crusaders in the Crusader history. So I believe this is where they just find a random lance and say, "Oh, this is the last that pierced Jesus and killed him on the cross."
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously what happens is when they manage the lands they conquer on the crusade forms then the nuclei of these crusader states that they establish. At the time when they're capturing just cities, like it's like Antioch, Edessa, Jerusalem, and not really much around it. But then after 99, they start to settle and basically colonize this land, or this religious colonization basically going on, and then they establish these really viable polities. In the first half of the 12th century, they're very aggressive. They've got kings like Baldwin I, Baldwin II, who are incredibly capable military leaders who are always in the saddle, always fighting. They'll ride north every year to Antioch to campaign up there, and they're establishing the coastal strategies. They're capturing these coastal cities, port cities, where they can get supplies, soldiers in, and pilgrims into the Holy Land. And they do that for a lot of the early part of the 12th century. And then they start to turn their eyes to the hinterland. So the hinterland strategy is then to strike out in the interior of Palestine and Syria, and start to try and expand the Crusader states in that direction as well. And by the middle of the 12th century, they've actually established really viable, pretty large territorial units. But then the second half of the 12th century is a period of decline for them. They struggle to get supplies and not supplies, they struggle to get reinforcements basically from the West. And you've got the counter crusade, this jihad idea that we talked about, becoming really powerful under really active military commanders on the side, so Zayn al-Abidin and Saladin. And so the fortune of slight shift, and the question is really how sustainable the Crusader states were. They were sustainable for the last 50 years, but I think once they faced concern Muslim opposition, this idea jihad from the middle of the 12th century onwards. They're not losing battle, but I think it is more difficult for them. But they still try new things. They try and invade Egypt as well in the latter part of the 12th century under kings like Amoric. They are still trying to be aggressive and trying to push out, but they're just having less success than they were at the start of the 12th century.
Now, I think it's time to talk about the establishment of the Crusader states. So let's talk a little bit about the establishment of how the Crusader states actually worked in right after and during the period as well. Because like I said earlier, I think the main goal of Alexius was because they lost a substantial amount of territory before the Crusade. And the main goal, of course, to gain the territory with help of Western soldiers, and so, but of course that he didn't get what he wanted because the establishment of Crusader states as well. And but how did they function, and what did they have to pay tribute to, say, Alexis, for example, or his son John? So let's talk a bit about the function of the Crusader states for a moment.
Yeah, so the way they function, I mean, they're basically, they all hang together as Crusader states because they all recognize that it's in their best interest to work together. So they're obviously natural allies, but actually they do end up fighting each other quite a lot for allies. And I think relations between them are always easy. So it doesn't always go without they're naturally going to always work for their connected assets. Actually, the rulers of each principality or kingdom, they're really, apart from Patmos of Jerusalem, the other ones are quite their own interest. Later in the period, in the later 12th and early 13th century, see them really often just doing their own thing, really. And I think, again, that just speaks to that complexity of that situation, that we shouldn't just set this up as this monolithic clash of civilizations between Christians and Muslims. I think that's just another piece of evidence to support that idea. But they do work together generally pretty effectively under normal circumstances, and they will fight together. They will raise armies to defend the different Crusader states. But usually it's the Kingdom of Jerusalem that's supporting the other ones, and that's, I think, is very much in the Kingdom of Jerusalem's best interest to defend the other Crusader states. They're really, basically, they don't really get any support from Byzantium very much at all. The relations with Byzantium go from bad to worse, really, over the course of the 12th century, until they can't really rely on help from Byzantium at all. So they're really reliant upon connection back to the West. This is the thing that raises the question about their sustainability as polities. So they need people to keep coming over and defending them, to fighting crusades. But what they really need is kind of a steady military force. The problem with Crusaders is that they turn up, they want to campaign for a season, and then they want to go home again. That's not always helpful, because sometimes they arrive during periods of truce. Sometimes they arrive and they just want to mess things up, basically, while the Franks are trying to pursue more sort of mature policies. And the problem is that these recruits also tend to dry up over the course of the later 12th century. So they're just not getting enough manpower in to be able to face off the really increasing threat that Saladin poses, basically, to them in the late 12th century. And that's why they end up losing Jerusalem in 1187 and most of the Crusader states. That they're just not sustainable, because they're not getting enough support from Europe, and they can't really sustain themselves without that.
And now it's time to introduce the Knight Templars, because like you said, when people just want to liberate Jerusalem and then go home, then it's pretty much pointless, because it's kind of ripe for the taking for the Seljuk Turks and the other Muslims who want to take back Jerusalem. So who are you going to have protect the city? And of course, it's where the idea behind the Knight Templars, and later, I believe, the Knight Hospitallers as well come in as a protection force against the Muslim forces. So let's talk a little bit about the nation of the Knight Templars and the Knight Hospitallers as well.
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent point. So thank you for bringing us on to that. They're really crucial. The Crusader states simply wouldn't have survived for any length of time without the support of the military orders. So exactly as you say, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and later the Teutonic Knights as well. These are basically military orders. So they are religious orders of monks, but they're ones who fight. And this is a really kind of problematic and really quite radical idea in the early 12th century when the Knights Templar formed as a military unit. The Knights Hospitaller had already existed and had been the Hospitallers. Had been fulfilling hospital functions. They hadn't been fighting, but this revolutionary idea is that you can have someone who is a monk who also is fighting, which is completely radical. They're really helpful for the Crusader states because they provide standing armies. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar each field about 300 knights, plus sergeants, plus auxiliaries in the standing armies, the field armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So you got about 600 knights then, which is a really pretty large number at this time, and also because they're so well trained and they're so well disciplined and they know the terrain so well that actually they're a kind of force multiplier for other knights. So the military obviously also have these huge networks and estates back in the West, and they're funneling money and men to the East, which they need to defend the Holy Land. And the key kind of strong points they have are these castles. They built up this huge network of castles across the Holy Land. And the military orders really are the only people that have a standing army and have enough money and resources to be able to garrison these. And it's hugely expensive to build them, like, crushingly expensive to build a castle and then to be able to garrison it as well. So they're the only ones that can do that. So they're really crucial in the defense of the Holy Land.
So was there tension? What was the relations like between the Knight Templars and the Knights Templars? Was it because they were two different organizations? Did they interact with it, or was there no interaction at all? Did they keep them to themselves, or was there a little bit tension between the two groups, or how did their relationship?
Oh, they're definitely frenemies. Yeah, I think they. I think with anything, when you've got two groups, and they're both trying to pursue the same thing in the same area, there's going to be friction, and so they do work together very well in Crusade armies. They're very good at fighting together as part of Crusade armies. But actually, yeah, there is tension between them at points, and there are some flare-ups between the Templars and Hospitallers. And I think it just feeds into that idea that I think when we're looking at the Crusades and the Crusader states, we sometimes have a kind of a simplistic view, and we think about them all. They must have all clubbed together, and obviously it's in their best interest to fight together. And usually it is, and generally in principle it is, but not always. And actually they do end up just that friction between them, the fact they're both trying to fulfill the same function in the same region, means they do sometimes come into conflict. So on the whole, they're absolutely crucial. The Crusader states would not have survived for as long as they did without the military orders. But equally, it's not just advantages. There are some disadvantages too. It's not perfect.
So now it's time to, of course, talk about the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and which is the most important, arguably, Crusader kingdom. So let's talk about the influence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And of course, later on, the title King of Jerusalem, though it was kind of insignificant by the, say, 15th century, it still held, in the West, it still held an important title in long after the Crusader states were gone. But let's talk a little bit about the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the importance of being the King of Jerusalem in the Crusades.
Yeah, so as you say, it's really fascinating history. The longer history of this, how this the title of being King of Jerusalem is then passed down and sold, for quite a long time after the Crusades. Actually, really well after the Crusader states have stopped existing in actual fact, and it has a great significance because of the location. Because for medieval Christians, Jerusalem is the most important site in their whole spiritual world. So this is the site, obviously, where Jesus lives, walks, dies, is resurrected, where his tomb is. And so this is of crucial importance. And so to be king in the Kingdom of Jerusalem brings with it great prestige and great spiritual importance in this age when obviously rulers were very much concerned about their soul and their religious devotion. So to be King of Jerusalem or Queen of Jerusalem, of course, was really of huge importance in terms of prestige and status. And really, there is no other crown which is as valuable as this in terms of prestige. And so it's really crucial. It's really the anchor point for those Crusader states. And without the Kingdom of Jerusalem and without the King and Queen of Jerusalem, actually, it'd be difficult, I think, to hold the Crusader states together for as long as they did.
Now it's time, before we go on the second Crusader, it's time to talk about that. And some historians describe this, I believe, as a bit, and think Dan Jones think this is a bit bizarre as well in his book, where the white Norwegian Crusader series from to. I mean, talked about it by the end in the episode as well, so we don't have to talk too much about it. But it's, of course, the Eurosafar comes to Eastern, to Constantinople, or Miklador, if you will. So but it's a bit. Some historians say it's a bit, and I try to agree that it's a bit strange that we choose to come right after the first day that ended, because there wasn't really much going on at the time he arrives to Constantinople. It's just it does some fighting in Al-Andalusia in Islamic Spain, but in the Holy Land there is really too much crusading going on. But we should also add that he actually set the precedent for later kings such as Richard Lionheart and the King of France go on crusade themselves. So he's the first king. In the first crusade there were no kings in the crusade. It was just noblemen and knights who went, but no king actually went himself. So he when I would set a precedent, it was still a bit, some historians describe strange that he would actually go on this crusade after the first crusade was finished.
Yeah, I think Sigurd plays a really key role, I think, and as you say, he's obviously the first crown king to go on crusade. I think what one idea I've tried to push a little bit in my book on the first crusade is that we should see the extension of the first crusade actually as a little bit longer, probably to about 1101. That those people who go on a crusade at the very end or just after the capture of Jerusalem, and really I think should be seen as part of the very last waves of the first crusade, because you can see that while the crusade's going on, actually there's still continual preaching going on. We can see that from the evidence of the letters from the first crusade, that they're still preaching the campaign and people are still joining and going on it. And so I think that probably what we need to do is to sort of conflate those later expeditions as part of the first crusade. And as you say, I think that he obviously sets a kind of template that will later on, and kings to go on crusade, it has benefits because they bring huge retinues, but sometimes they can be quite problematic as when you've got competing. I think on the second crusade, when you see the French and Germans competing on the crusade, and Richard the Lionheart for the English, French on the third crusade, sometimes it actually brings problems with it. So it's Sigurd's crucial importance, but I think also that it's quite interesting looking at whether the kings is it a huge benefit to have them on crusade. Sometimes I think in most cases it is a huge benefit if you can get them to work together, but often they don't. If there are multiple kings, they don't often get on with each other very well, which is a problem.
I mean, take Richard, for example, he pretty much pissed everyone off, and that would go back to bite him when on his return journey. So they didn't always get along very well.
No. No, I think Richard's. I think Richard treads on a lot of people's toes. They say that.
Now let's talk a little bit about the launch of the second crusade, why that was such a failure compared to the first crusade. Because the first crusade is very shouldn't, but the second crusade was actually a disaster. So what made the second crusade fail compared to the first? And let's talk a little bit about what would launch a second crusade. Of course, they didn't call it the second crusade at the time or the first crusade, but that would be a later invention. But let's, for simplicity, let's call it the second crusade. So let's talk about what would launch the second crusade and why it was such a failure.
Yeah, so the second crusade holds such promise at the time. I think that it's a bit like, I've got a real soft spot for the second crusade. I really like it a lot. But I think it's probably, we can think of it as analogous to disappointing sequels like Ghostbusters 2 or Speed 2, where, after the first one, everyone thought, this was really,
or the
really
second
impressive.
Trump presidency.
Well, although the first term was also terrible.
Yeah. I couldn't help myself.
Yeah. And I think so after the First Crusade, such a huge success, you've got a generation of people who have grown up with the stories of the success of the First Crusade. It's a huge cultural phenomenon that has this massive, long-lasting cultural legacy. And so after the First Crusade, there hasn't been another major crusade until the second one, so in the 1140s. And so you've got this generation of people who've grown up on the stories of the deeds of the First Crusaders, and this is their chance then to kind of to live up to those deeds and to prove themselves to be also worthy to the memories and examples of their ancestors. And so I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for the Second Crusade. Obviously, they get two kings recruited, so Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. And there's huge recruitment. It looks really, really good, actually, that this is going to be a huge success, and they're going to strike a lasting blow that's going to take another big Muslim city. The problem is that firstly, the French and Germans don't get on very well with each other. They don't get on well with the Byzantines, so they're kind of clashing along the way on the crusade. They struggle with access to markets and food, and they plunder a lot. It's not very well controlled. Once they get over into Asia Minor, they actually suffer a lot of losses. So they arrive at Constantinople, they meet up, but what happens is the forces split up then. They don't leave together, they leave separately. And what happens is they both suffer then defeats on the journey east because they're not working together as a coherent unit. So they suffer a lot of losses in the Cadmus Mountains, for example. And then what happens is they get to the Holy Land. They get to Antioch. There's sort of, again, problems there, sort of dissension between them and the Franks. And then they have to decide what to do with their armies. So their armies, which have been so vast and looking really, really strong and hold a lot of promise. The problem is they've been denuded now, so they're not as strong as they were. They're not working very well together, and they haven't got a clear, defined target. So the Second Crusade had been launched because one of the Crusader states had basically been wiped out. So Edessa had been lost to Zengi. So the Crusade had been recruited on the idea that they would go and they would recover Edessa and they would bring relief and succor to the Crusader state of Edessa. The problem is it's kind of harder to get people to go to Edessa. They try and do a good job in terms of building up the spiritual significance of it, but it doesn't have the same pull that Jerusalem had for the First Crusade. So they don't have this unifying objective. The other problem is strategically, Edessa is really hard to hold. It's got porous borders, and this is why it was lost in the first place. It's very difficult to defend, unlike Antioch or even Jerusalem, where you can adopt like defense and depth strategies and so on. So they don't want to go to Edessa. So where do they go? Well, they alight on the idea then of attacking Damascus, which is a huge Muslim power base in the region. But it's also a huge blunder because Damascus had actually been allied with the Franks up to this point. They're really worried about Damascus coming into the political orbit of Aleppo, which is the other great Muslim power base in the region. And they think if Damascus and Aleppo unite, it's going to be impossible to hold the Crusader states. They're going to wipe us out, which is a real threat. But of course, it's a bit of a blunder because Damascus had been until recently allied with them, so they attack their allied city, which wasn't a great idea probably. And the problem is that the siege is executed poorly, so you get the sense that not everyone's hearted in it. This is a kind of a compromise in terms of which city to target in the first place. The Franks who are with them don't really want to attack it. I think there's some hand-to-hand fighting in orchards around the city. They establish the siege. A relief army's on its way. So Nuruddin's on his way to defend the city. And ironically, what happens is, of course, their actions actually bring about what they most feared. Damascus then goes to Aleppo and Nuruddin for help. It pushes Damascus into this sort of quite tense unity, Aleppo, to fight off the Crusaders. They make a strategic decision where they move basically in camp before the city. Got a really good location with lots of access to orchards, things like that. The problem is, though, Nuruddin's on his way. They need entry to the city, and they're told by the army that easier wall to attack the city from, and then if they just go round to this wall, they can take the city. So they move round, and they move their camp. They realise though there's no water there; it's unsustainable to maintain the siege with Odin coming. So they give up on the siege. They just strike the camp and abandon the siege, and that's it. They just go home, and that's the end of the Second Crusade. So it held such promise, but they made massive errors along the way, which leads to being a huge failure.
Actually, I want to go back a little bit about the Crusade, because something we haven't mentioned, or you haven't mentioned, is you mentioned briefly, but Louis VII had a very famous wife that came with him, of course, Crusade, and that, of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Let's talk a little bit about those two. It wasn't their relationship great. It really rocked by this time they left as well. Why they thought it makes their relationship taking a little holiday to the Holy Land, so to speak, but it didn't help. And there's also several rumors that she slept with her uncle. And to be fair, that wasn't entirely uncommon among the elite at that time, so it could be kind of plausible that she did. But there's also a rumor that she slept with a Saladin, which historians have disputed because he was just like 11 years old at the time, and I don't think even medieval people did child, and I don't know how she would know that for Saladin at the time, even if she did sleep with an 11-year-old boy. But let's talk a little bit about the relationship with Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine on the Crusade journey.
Yeah, so I think those kind of rumors that fly around the figure, and I think I think for the most part, scholars would discount those rumors. I think certainly what happens at Antioch is that Louis VII and the Prince of Antioch don't get on, and there's tension there. And I think really the kind of salacious gossip about the affair between Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Prince of Antioch, I think it's just character assassination, basically, that trying to assassinate Eleanor's character, basically, and I think that I think we should see it as this kind of tension and between the Crusaders and the Franks. I don't think there's any convincing evidence that she does have an affair with her uncle, but there's certainly what the chroniclers record at the time. But I think there's a kind of ulterior motive.
I mean, to be fair, family affairs at such time, it wasn't entirely uncommon either in those times, were they?
Well, I mean, there's very strict rules about consanguinity in the period. So, although I think obviously what happens is the way that royal dynasties, the marriages are arranged, that often I think you do get matches where there is some consanguinity, but I think there are very strict rules about what degrees of consanguinity are allowed in medieval marriage, and actually so I think distant cousins, like very second cousins and things, I think is okay in the rules of medieval marriage law. But I'm not an expert on this. I don't know.
Now let's talk about between the Second and the Third Crusade, and of course this is where the famous movie Kingdom of Heaven takes place. And I want to have your thoughts on the movie as well, because it has some criticism by historians of this era. But I read an article somewhere, I don't remember where it is, if I can find it again. But I think the one article I read where that you have to remember the time that it was coming out, and it was, I believe, early, right after 9/11 happened, and the view on Muslims as well were very different from what it is now. I mean, of course, you have some bigots today too, but it's we have to take into consideration the time that the movie came out in as well. And like I said, it was right after 9/11, almost a few years afterwards. So as well, and people call Bush attack on Iraq as a crusade as well. So actually, let's talk a little bit about that too. We will later, but let's talk a little bit about Kingdom of Heaven and the time between the Second and Third Crusade.
Yeah, so
and I believe that he was a real based on real character, but of course it's it's not historically accurate of being Ridley Scott, of course, that's a given, but and it was the character in who Orlando Bloom played was inspired by a real character, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, well, I love Ridley Scott films. I think they're great. So, but I think King of Heaven's a brilliant film. It's what's really interesting about it is that it's based quite closely on some of the primary sources from the period. So it seems to be, from my viewing of it, seems to be pretty close to William of Tyre's Chronicle in terms of the story and the basic lines of the history. So it's, although it's not perhaps as close to sort of modern historiography as we might like, it's pretty close to some of the primary sources, which is really interesting. Balin of Evelyn is a real person. What's interesting though is obviously for poetic license, what happens to him is that during the real history of the Crusade, he abandons Jerusalem pretty much straight away. So in the film, he obviously is the heroic defender who organizes the defense and stays with it to the very end. But actually, in real life, he hightails it and heads out of there straight away. So that obviously doesn't make quite as compelling a film. But yeah, it's basically there are parts of it that are based on the real history. It's just that obviously it's other parts are kind of poetic license. But I think it's a great film, and I think thinking about the time it's created as well, as you say, it comes out in the aftermath of 9/11, and I think actually what Ridley Scott's trying to do there as well is to, again, I guess in a popular way, is to add nuance to that. Some of the popular understandings at the time of there were mistakenly making a connection between those modern conflicts and historical wars of the Crusades, and this idea that that conflicts have been going on in the Holy Land, and there's unbroken opposition between Christians and Muslims since the Crusades and before, which is obviously incorrect. And so I think that he was trying to redress the balance a bit there, and showing Saladin as a very positive figure, as he was indeed thought of in the medieval West. He has a very positive reputation in the medieval primary sources. He's seen as a paragon of chivalry, really. So I think, again, it's just this complexity. And so I really rate the film. I like it a lot. I think if you want the history, go and read the history books. But I think if you want some entertainment, I think you can get a great evening in with some popcorn and some Kingdom of Heaven, definitely.
Now, let's talk about the relationship with Richard Lionheart and Saladin, because I'm going to use some other term. There was kind of a little bit of romance between the two. They had tremendous respect for each other, and though they never met in real life, they did write letters of respect to each other when they were fighting both in the Holy Land.
Yeah, so it's really interesting their relationship with each other, and as you say, I think it's one marked by a mutual respect. And I think they kind of probably see each other as equals, I think. So they're militarily, they're obviously opposed to each other, but they do give each other gifts. They engage in negotiations. They're, if they weren't fighting each other, actually, as you say, they have a pretty positive relationship, which is really interesting.
Now we have to talk about the famous massacre of Acre, of course, and how that was. What was that view like when Richard Lionheart killed all those POWs? Because of course, like you said before, the point that the Geneva Convention did not exist, of course, and the treatment of POWs, and of course it's an atrocity. That being said, we should as well think about the circumstances of that situation, I think, because this is the Holy Land. It's probably in the desert somewhere. It's desert land, and they have to move the Crusader armies around. And of course, they could do a prisoner exchange. That would make it easier. But if they were to drag the POWs around, they had to feed them. They had to give them shelter. They had to give them food and water. That should have gone to the troops as well. And I'm not condoning. It's absolutely horrendous. And that I'm not trying to justify the massacre in Acre, but I'm just trying to give this a kind of a perspective view. But am I right in saying that we have to think about the circumstances that Richard was in when he decided to. Of course, it was a brutal and horrendous way, but I'm writing thinking about the circumstances of that situation.
Yeah, so I think we definitely have to try and understand it through an objective historical lens, as you say.
And sorry for the interruption. How was this viewed in the massacre of Hungary? How was it viewed in Europe at the time?
Yeah,
Compared to Argentina in a way.
Yeah, I think it's probably viewed in different terms than Agincourt. I think as you say, it's a horrific massacre that occurs of about 2,700 unarmed Muslim prisoners. But I think to understand it, we have to go beyond our shock at how horrific this is. And I think looking now at the strategic situation provides the best way to understand it. So I think what Saladin had been trying to do was try and pin. They're basically in agreement, and Richard would release these prisoners if Saladin, particular things, paid rents and so on, returned the true and so on. And what Saladin does is pays for time. He doesn't pay over the ransom money, return true cost. And what he's trying to do probably is to tie Richard down, because that's a huge number of captives that, as you need sustenance for them, and he's trying to sustain his Crusader army as well, and obviously it's difficult anyway. And so, as you say, it's no excuse for the action, but I think a way of understanding it is to see that he can't basically keep control of such a large number of. He can't move. He's pinned down in these captives. He can't leave them because they'll overwhelm the garrison and they'll lose the city of Acre for such a long time to take. He can't take them with because they, that's what he would think, that he can't take them because they represent a threat as well to him. So I think it's kind of power play between Saladin and Richard, and it's an absolutely brutal one. But I think Richard sees it as strategically necessary to be able to continue with the crusade and to try and recapture Jerusalem.
Now, we're going to leave the Third Crusade a little bit. I'm going to run up soon, but I want to talk a little bit about the Fourth. Everyone's favorite crusade, the famous Fourth Crusade that was supposed to retake Egypt, that they later would try with the Fifth Crusade. We will come back to that in a second, but let's talk about the infamous Fourth Crusade that would later, as historians say, launched the Renaissance as well.
Yeah, so the Fourth Crusade represents a shift in the strategy of the whole crusading movement. They basically, as you say, target Egypt. So the idea is they're going to knock out basically the main Muslim power base in the region. So Egypt is the richest land in the region. It's a huge source of grain. A lot of their military force comes from there. And so the Crusaders see that if we could take out Egypt, then actually we could hold on to Jerusalem long term in a sustainable fashion, basically, and not have to be able to keep fighting these huge armies all the time. So they decided Egypt. Happens that it really
forgive me. I just will run real quick to the bathroom. Just real quick. If you could keep talking, I'll be right back with you.
No worries. So what happens then is a really complex series of events where they end up then besieging the Byzantine state of Byzantium, and they besiege the city of Constantinople, its capital city, and they end up capturing it basically for Christianity and then new polity, basically the Latin of Constantinople, and this is a new state that they set up there, and they see this really as being an ally in the region. So for the Crusaders, I think in the Crusader states, this is something that is seen as an advantage because the Byzantines have not really rendered a lot of support since the First Crusade, and so by this period, this means that they've got an ally in the region. The problem is though, really with the Latin Empire of Constantinople, that it's not really a huge success. So by the end of by the century, it's over really, and they're able to support the Crusades. So the Fourth Crusade doesn't bring about any major sort of geopolitical boon the Crusader state.
Now, of course, I think we don't going to end soon with this, but you're writing a book on this topic, and that is the Fifth Crusade. I think from 2027, I think you said it's coming out. So let's talk a little bit about the Fifth Crusade, which they actually accomplished the idea that they had to retake Egypt before going to Jerusalem, because and why didn't they think about this in the First Crusade or earlier Crusades, where and there is a certain logic behind this, because as most people who read any history of Egypt know, that it's kind of been a breadbasket of the Middle East, and of course Roman Empire as well. So it was tremendously important if you wanted to feed troops and if you wanted to feed Jerusalem, because the grain had to come from somewhere. So why do you think that could it have been better and easier to hold Jerusalem, say, if they had actually retaken tried to take Egypt as early as on the First Crusade? And why did they not attempt this sooner? And why did this idea that we have to take Egypt as a strategic resource come sooner?
Yeah, so why it doesn't happen earlier is basically because they still they have the power to do it. Basically, as you say, Egypt is the breadbasket. It's the source of money, of provisions, of soldiers. It's really the one of the obviously big foes of the Crusader states in the period. At the start of the 12th century, they're just not strong enough. They're really trying to establish the Crusader states in Palestine and Syria. They are trying to pursue, because of course they don't have access, they don't have control of like the whole region at the time, so they're focused on that first. But they do turn to Egypt, and they fight in Egypt. There's lots of battles at Ramla, several battles there in the early 12th century. They do invade as well in the latter half of the 12th century with Amoric in the 1160s, and they launch campaigns there. So it's very much in their sights. I think they just don't have the capacity to be able to defend the Crusader states and to invade Egypt. And obviously they try with the Fifth Crusade and the Seventh Crusade of Louis IX. They do invade Egypt, and they really get some great success there. But yeah, unfortunately for the Crusaders, they don't manage to capitalize on it as well as they could have done.
Now, I think that there's, like you said, there's of course several crusades, but it's and most people associate the crusades with the Middle East, but that's not necessarily true, because there were European crusades as well. So let's talk a little bit about the European crusades as well. That may not be familiar to so many people who are not familiar with Crusader history or medieval 11th century Crusading history. So that's 11th, 12th century European history. So let's talk a little bit about the European Crusades.
Yeah, so basically what happens is you get a proliferation of this crusading idea that actually crusading expands into different theatres. From very early on, you get already the idea of a crusade being applied in Spain from the very beginning, basically, and you get crusading then expanding against other. Basically trying to expand the borders of Christendom, basically. So you've got in the Baltic, in the North, the Baltic crusades against pagans there. You've got crusading in the south of France against the Albigensian heretics there. You've got crusading in Spain, obviously. And then later you've got these political crusades as well against the enemies of the papacy. So it's quite a flexible idea that can be applied to different enemies of the papacy, basically. I think it's kind of problematic to think about. Again, I'd like to kind of nuance this idea. I don't think the papacy is kind of trying to eliminate all its threats, and I don't think it just sees it necessarily as kind of expanding Christendom on all of its frontiers simultaneously. But I think it does apply the crusade idea to different non-Christian enemies and some Christian enemies too.
So something I want to talk about is, of course, you mentioned the Seventh Crusade. So let's talk a little bit about Frederick II and how he actually managed to get back Jerusalem without even a bloodshed by making a deal with the with the enemy, but this wasn't very well. Ironically enough, this wasn't very well perceived in the
No.
papacy or Europe. That you should think you should be commended for actually being able to do this without even lifting a sword, but it's was rather condemned by Europe and the papacy that he didn't. They wanted bloodshed. They didn't want peaceful negotiations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So obviously, with first you've got the Fifth Crusade, which invades Egypt, captures Damietta, and strikes towards Cairo, and very nearly is successful. Actually, they experience a lot of military success. The key problem of Fifth Crusade, well, one of the key problems it has, is that they're waiting for Frederick II to arrive for the entire campaign. That hamstrings the campaign and their strategic decisions because they're waiting. He's on the cusp of leaving on the crusade, doesn't quite make it. So that really affects the strategy of the crusade. And basically what happens is the crusade fails, the Nile floods, they get caught in the flood waters, and they have to give back Damietta, which they'd besieged for about 17 months. It's an incredibly long medieval siege, and it was really a huge success. It was a glittering prize for the Crusaders because they had captured this huge major Muslim port city in Egypt, the first big city there they captured. It was a huge success, and actually should have capitalized on it. And it led to afterwards huge recriminations in Europe. Like people are really, really unhappy that they've lost this after this massive siege and this huge expenditure. And actually, this had represented perhaps a turning point for the crusading movement and the history of the Crusader states. The problem is Frederick doesn't go on that crusade. He's back in the West. He's always promising to go and delaying and missing his deadlines. So he finally goes on his crusade as an excommunicate. So the new Pope Gregory IX says, if you don't go on crusade by this deadline, I'll excommunicate you. And Frederick doesn't go, so he gets excommunicated.
And,
so he's
to give a little background, sorry for interrupting you, but
yeah.
Hohenzollerns and not Hohenzollern, but the Hohenstaufens and the papacy, they did not famously with his grandfather Barbarossa as well. They did not go on very well with each other.
No, the German Empire and the papacy have a kind of tricky relationship. With under Honorius III, who I've got a very soft spot for. Actually, they have a very good, positive relationship, but generally they're very much afraid of the empire because there's the danger. Basically, the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, consists of lands sort of centered on modern Germany in the north, and then also you've got the Kingdom of Sicily in the south. And what they're terrified about in this time is that Frederick II is going to unite those two crowns because he's already King of Sicily. And so if he becomes crowned Holy Roman Emperor, he's going to unite those two lands, which sandwich the papal states between them, and that actually is going to crush them like in a nutcracker, basically. And so they're really about that. So the papacy want to maintain independence and sovereignty, basically, and end up at odds. Gregory executed and he on crusade as an excommunicate, and the whole thing is very short. He goes over, he negotiates with the Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil, who had actually been the leader of the Muslim forces against the Fifth Crusade and had been a very good general in that, and very chivalrous, again, very much like in the cast of Saladin. And he negotiates to recover Jerusalem and gets Jerusalem back and a strip of land to the coast so that pilgrims can get to it. And then they hold to Jerusalem for just over a decade in that way. And so he recovers Jerusalem without the loss of blood at all. And I think for Frederick, he sees this as the fulfillment of these prophecies. So he's looking at dominion on a sort of international stage, really, and he sees himself as fulfilling these prophecies by being crowned King of Jerusalem in Jerusalem. And so I don't think he's quite worried about the same things the papacy is worried about. And obviously this leads to the papacy, and then you've got people take sides, and so there's a lot of sort of bad feeling and fallout from this, but he does manage to recover Jerusalem for a time before it's finally lost again in the 40s, never again to be recovered by Crusaders. So it's a fascinating history.
Now let's talk about the Mongols, and we talked a little bit about this in the Mongol Storm episode with Nicholas Morton a while back in December, but let's talk a little bit about the Mongol storm and the Mongols impact on the Crusader state and how this would later cause the fall of the Crusader states. Because, as we said, Nicholas Morton said in our episode, and I would highly recommend checking it out. He said that it wouldn't be some fantastic end to the Crusader state. It would be kind of was rather boring end for the Crusaders.
Yeah, so the Mongol threat for the Crusaders, I mean, that changes the whole. That we talk about this geopolitical situation at the early on in the podcast, right, in the stream. So basically, the coming of the Mongols completely changes this. Now, the Muslims actually have a much bigger, more dangerous enemy than the Crusaders, and the Crusaders are kind of facing them off too. The Crusaders think at the start that maybe actually they'll be allies against the Muslim powers, and so yeah, it's a kind of existential threat for the Crusaders, but especially for the Muslim leaders in the region, and they managed to stem the tide and to stop them. But it's they're the huge threat which really influences the nature of strategy making in the region by both Crusaders and Muslims in the latter half of in the sort of 13th century, basically.
So no, I think I said it earlier, but we're going to end now. But I want to talk about the crusade in popular imagination in the 21st century, and how. But before that, I want to begin with Bush's invasion. And we talked about 9/11 a little bit earlier, and now I'm probably going to be demoted for mentioning 9/11 as I heard rumors that YouTube do now, but in. Other people call the Bush invasion of Iraq a crusade. So, what are your, as a crusade historian, what are your thoughts on the Bush invasion of Iraq as in 2001 as a form of modern crusade in the 21st century?
Yeah, so again, this comes back to this abuse and misuse of the history in the modern period. So it wasn't a crusade, because a crusade is obviously, it's a historical thing, but it's scholars define it as being a holy war that's launched by the Pope, and this obviously doesn't fit those criteria. It was not a crusade, but he misused the terminology and called it a crusade, and the problem is that then led to this proliferation of this idea about this kind of clash of civilizations idea, which we've been thinking about problematizing during this live stream, and it kind of fed into those people who were looking to misuse this history. So yeah, it was, I think, poor use of language there, which had really negative knock-on effects.
So what about, and this is something that fascinates me, and I did try to find this photo. Let's see if I can find it again, because it's fascinating. But it was like I found a photo in a Facebook group where this guy posts that be proud of your ancestors. Then you have a Spartan, you have a Roman soldier, you have a Viking, you have a Crusader. I think it's a Knights Templar, where it says remember who you are. This is clearly trying to point at right-wing propaganda for that we are this warrior race, that this white supremacy race fighting infidel barbarians. But what are your thoughts on right-wing media and right-wing right-wings using and the crusade for their own gain and using this as the holy war, and it was, that's fair, but using this in the 21st century as anti-Muslim propaganda and using this for anti-immigration propaganda, etc. That the right wing uses this to promote their views in the 21st century.
Yeah, so again, this falls under the misuse and abuse of the history and the sort of willful twisting of this history to serve these agendas. And I think this it underlines the reason why it's so important to understand the history of the Crusades and those other things as well. I think it's interesting that a lot of the right-wing nationalist tropes sort of focus on Crusades, on Vikings, and these mistaken ideas of around race and religion. And I think that it just underlines the fact that it's really important that we understand the history properly so that we can combat that misuse and abuse of the history.
So I think, and of course, I want not just right wing, but in general, what do you think people for the first century, for those who are not as invested read too much? What do you think it is about, both in media, movies, TV shows, or in general popular imagination? What do you think it is about Crusade that fill us with it, like yourself ended up studying this? What do you think is fill us with this imagination, and perhaps some mystery? What you just wrong about the First Crusade in again in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think it's a lasting interesting. It ties into this kind of the legacy of the cultural idea of the crusade, which we already see going back in history a long way. If we look back to the modern period and afterwards, actually the idea of crusade is really firmly embedded within the culture in that period. And I think what we're seeing now is an extension of that and sort of faint echoes of it. I think the history is really interesting. The legacy of the idea is fascinating too. And again, I think it's obviously a topic that appears a lot in movies and games. And I think there's obviously this idea of the Templars as well, has a grip on popular imagination, and it's tied in with lots of conspiracy theories and so I think it's a very, I think as an idea, a set of ideas, it has a certain hook in the popular imagination, and I think that's why it's really important that I think we do these kind of things where we're nuancing and complicating the history, and rather than just sort of having this airbrushed format that one sees on social media and in the sort of popular culture sometimes.
So, if you could have a movie about the Crusades, what story from the first? We had a few stories already, not too much. But what story would you like to have seen on the silver screen from the Crusader era?
Well, this is a good question. It's an easy one. I'm going to have to say it's got to be the Fifth Crusade, because that's what I'm writing my new book about at the moment. And just to say, film rights are still available in case anyone's interested. I think I think actually I would like to see the Fifth Crusade as a movie. There's a really good docudrama, which I think is called The Sultan and the Saint. I've got it on DVD, which is really interesting. But I think, and it's narrated by Liam Neeson, I think that's probably star quality there. But what I would like to see a movie about the Fifth Crusade. I think it's got everything, and I hope that the book I'm writing is called The Egyptian Crusade, and it's coming out with Yale University Press. It's my first book for a general audience, so it's a narrative history. It's going to be very accessible. Hopefully, it's going to be pacey and exciting to read. And I think what I'm trying to do is to tell that story in an accessible way, in a book format. And so hopefully maybe a movie will follow. We don't know.
You heard it first there, people. If there's any Hollywood executives who are interested, or BBC, you know where to find him. So actually, maybe they don't. So if there are the Hollywood executives out there that's watching this live stream, or anyone else that for that matter, who have further questions about the Crusades, or if people want to write a current book rewriting the First Crusade, which we sadly did not have time to talk about today, but we do talk about it in our episode on the First Crusade. Again, check it out. It's absolutely brilliant episode. Where do people find you on social media if they have any questions, or do you have anything else you want to share before we end the show?
Yeah, so you can find me on social media on Instagram as Medieval Tom, on Facebook as well, and I've got a website, thomaswsmith.co.uk, where you can keep up to date with all my latest publications and podcasts and things.
Thank you so much for coming on again. It's been a great pleasure to do this live stream with you. This has been Without H12. We're trying to do, about this time of month, we're trying to do a live stream once a month, so stay tuned. If you missed this live stream, you can always watch on the next month. I was not sure what the next topic will be, but I have an idea. So let's see what we come up with. And stay tuned for Yeah, you can ask question, Natalie, but unfortunately, Natalie, we are ending it. But if you do have a question, feel free to ask before we go. So perhaps we can
Oh
answer
yeah,
if you.
let's have a
Yeah,
question from Natalie. So I
if
think
you
she's
have a
been waiting for
question,
long.
you
Yeah.
feel free to ask before we go.
Yeah.
So just don't wait until she writes her question. And
Yeah. No, but line on it.
yeah, fortunately, we saw the comment before we ended the live stream. But if you do,
Yeah.
feel free to ask the question, and we try to see if you can answer it. But yeah, we to go while we're waiting. We are available on social media under that well, all on Twitter, Instagram, and you and Blue Sky. Sorry, and. Yeah, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever we can find podcasts these days. And we recently released our latest episode on the German Empire with returning just Roger Chickering. So that's I highly recommend checking that one out. It's super fascinating. We talked about I know how the German Empire functioned, and it's just a general history. It's a Soviet history of the German Empire that I would highly recommend checking out. So we are still waiting. If you have a question, Natalie, now I've said I don't mean to rush you, but if you have a question, now is a chance because I'm going to end very soon. So if you have a question now, so I'm going to give you a few minutes. There you go. In case you finally wrote a question, so we're going to end with this question from the live stream. As you asked, in many ways, the county of Tripoli was more unique than any other Crusader state. Tripoli's position towards the other Crusader states was at many a times questionable. So why is Tripoli often overlooked in Crusader history, despite its significant complex role? And that's a really good question. If you can answer
That's a
that.
great question. Thank you, Natalie, for such a great question. I think, yeah, I agree with you entirely. I think Tripoli is often not given the attention that it deserves. There has been some recent research on it, which has been really important. I think Kevin Lewis wrote a really great book about Tripoli. I think if I remember correctly. But yeah, why is it not written about as much? I mean, my gut feeling is probably to do with the survival of source material. I, you know, and I don't really um, I don't work on Tripoli. This is obviously I'm part of the problem here. I think, but I don't research about the Crusader states directly. It's not my main area of research, so I don't know. I'm not speaking with authority here, but my impression would probably be that is probably less source material than there is for the rulers of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, especially. That would be my gut feeling. But I think you make a really important point that Tripoli has a really crucial role and really important one that we should definitely factor in more. So thank you for your great question.
She has another one, and that is question. I don't know if she finished writing, but in Kingdom of Heaven was not the only movie which came out during a turbulent time of modern history. The film Saladin, 1963, came out
Mm.
after Arab Israel. I'm not sure I see the question, but I think she mentioned a more statement. But after the Arab-Israeli War and Arab nationalism,
Mhm.
Saladin was not an Arab, well, was an Arab hero, and many Arab nationalist poetry sorry of the time written about Arab Muslims and Christians brought back heroes from the past, like Saladin wrote about defeating the new Crusaders, Israel, and its Western allies. The Arab world still holds grudges against Crusader history. Do you think these modern representations play a role in the negative view of the Crusaders by Arab and Muslims, and how can this be improved? I think that's the last question for this time. You can, of course, join us in the next monthly live stream if you have further questions, of course. But we're going to ask this as the last questions for today.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. Yeah, Saladin's, yeah, a really interesting film. I saw it I remember Jonathan Phillips presented it in the Institute of Historical Research in London, and we had like a viewing party. It's quite a long film, as I recall. And as you say, I think that the timing of when this film was released is crucial, and I think again it fits into that. And I think it's really important to contextualize. We were talking earlier about the misuse and abuse of history, and again, actually, that falls under that umbrella as well. I think, isn't it? This use of figures from the Crusades, from both sides, actually, to pursue and push kind of modern political agendas and how they're used. And I think definitely you're exactly right that films like that help to propagate these ideas that sort of this idea of a clash of civilizations, and of course what they're, as you say, that there's a connection there between the film and the Arab-Israeli war, and how people were trying deliberately to link modern conflict to the Middle Ages and the Crusades, and they're forging that connection there, which is it's not the kind of maybe obvious in what's actually in the film if you don't know the historical context of when it's produced. So I think that's crucial. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think there's a lot of great work on the modern legacies of the Crusades in film and games and things. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question.
And you also, and I don't think I wanted to mention this film, and it's on Netflix, I think, but it's not not too famous outside Scandinavia. But it's based by Jan Royo. I don't know if you're familiar with the author, but he wrote a book series called Arn, and it's it's a really good series, and it's also a movie, but it's been actually made into a series on Netflix. So that is also another Crusader, and like I said, I don't can't think of many more Crusader movies, at least in the past 20 years, that come out, other than Kingdom of Heaven and on. So I don't see a whole lot of, and I think there's a great potential, especially maybe a Fourth Crusade movie. That would be really cool to see.
Yeah.
But it's Arn is another example that's is about the Crusades, and you actually, of course, it is do get the kind of white sympathizer for the other side, but and I don't think it's too unrealistic. I think Jan Ryo is a historian himself. I don't know anything about it, but I read somewhere that he is. But that is one movie that I would highly recommend as well. That's set in, it's both Swedish and English, but it's absolutely really good movies. It is like 5 parts on Netflix, I think. So I just don't know if it's still there, but I would highly recommend checking that one out.
Yeah, agreed. It's great.
So I think we're gonna end it up there. I'm trying to see if I can do a live stream about the same time next month. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been What That Aged Well. My name is Alan. Thank you for the questions, Natalie. I hope more people will engage in the chat later live streams. So please do try and tune in when I post. Stay tuned for the YouTube post when I announce the next live stream. And take care. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Bye.